Welcome to Fasken's 16th Annual Global Mining Group Seminar Series. My name is Virginia Schweitzer, and I'm a partner in Fasken's Ottawa office and a member of the firm's corporate commercial group. Today's webinar, Overcoming Nuclear Power Supply Chain Challenges from Uranium Mining and Beyond, is the fifth of 12 seminars in our 2026 PDAC series. A link to the full list of Fasken's PDAC events can be found beneath the video window. As you view the information slide on the screen, I would like to provide a land acknowledgement. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have been present in Canada for thousands of years. These Indigenous peoples have a profound and ongoing attachment to this territory. As Fasken, we recognize that we have a role to play in the ongoing process of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, here and elsewhere in Canada. We have embarked on the reconciliation journey by adopting a plan with an overall purpose of contributing meaningfully to reconciliation. I now turn it over to my colleague, Ian Palm, to introduce today's speakers.
Thanks a lot, Virginia. Appreciate that. And thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking an interest in this. As mentioned, my name's Ian Palm. I'm a partner in Fasken's Toronto office. I'm a member of the Global Mining Group. I'm also the co-leader of our Global Energy and Climate Group. Joining us today are four experts in the space, and I really appreciate their making time available and sharing their insights. So we've got Pat Dalzell. Pat is Vice President and Corporate Affairs and Market Development at Bruce Power. Pat leads government and stakeholder engagement, corporate communications, and market development initiatives at Bruce Power, with a particular focus on energy innovation and the role of nuclear technology in advancing health and sustainability. AJ Goulding is president of London Economics International. AJ brings more than 25 years of experience advising on energy markets and infrastructure with deep expertise in nuclear asset development, electricity market design, and international power sector reform. Michelle Leslie is executive advisor at Deloitte, where she advises on strategic matters impacting large-scale energy and infrastructure projects. Michelle has more than 20 years experience at the intersection of nuclear policy, regulatory affairs, and stakeholder engagement, with deep expertise spanning fission and fusion, international energy forums, and the social and environmental dimensions of energy innovation. And Liam Mooney is Senior Vice President and Chief Legal Officer at Cameco Corporation. Liam oversees global legal and regulatory strategy for one of the world's largest uranium producers, and he brings a particular deep expertise in nuclear regulation, in environmental matters, and governance across mining and nuclear fuel cycle matters. So we've got some real experts here today, and when you signed up to this webinar, you will have noticed that we have a bit of a plan here. So the goal of this conversation over the next hour or more will be as follows. So as the world accelerates towards a cleaner energy future, nuclear power is reclaiming its role as a cornerstone of sustainable electricity generation. Yet there are some complex challenges here. This includes expanding and developing new uranium mining and production capacity, addressing many sector-related geopolitical tensions, and lack of fuel enrichment capacity required by most large new nuclear power plants, as well as many, if not all, next generation SMRs. Today's session, we hope, we will hope to dig into some detail here, and how the nuclear energy power sector will overcome some of these hurdles and deliver some of its promise. Our panel intends to dive into the strategies needed to strengthen nuclear power supply chains and ensure that energy security for decades to come becomes a reality. So what we've got here is a bunch of experts. I'm going to start asking some questions and invite our panelists to share some insights. I'm also going to encourage those attending in person on the webinar, if they wish, to use the Q&A function in their web portal to propose questions if they wish, and we will try to interleave those questions within the conversation we're having. With that in mind, we've got a lot to cover here, and so if we don't get to your question till later in the session, my apologies. We're trying to cover off an ambitious set of considerations. So the first theme that we're trying to cover off here is looking at the demand drivers in the new nuclear reality. So the first question I'm going to address to Liam, but I'm going to invite others to weigh in as they see appropriate. So Liam, what changes in recent years in Canada and beyond, and given that the rise in this new renewed interest in nuclear power, what has changed over that period of time? What are the main drivers from your perspective behind the growing interest in nuclear energy as a solution to address climate change? And I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here, and want to thank Ian for putting this session together, and Fasken's for hosting me from their office today. I guess when I look through the lens over the last number of years, the alignment that we saw on clean electrons originally started with a focus on climate change. That was accelerated after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the West's need to ensure energy security became more front and center, and nuclear's reliability and unique attributes brought it further into focus. The addition or the evolution of generative AI, the national security nature of the race to build large language models, and the related significant power needs really highlighted the advantages of nuclear power. I wanted to emphasize that these underlying drivers are not one-off supply-demand events that come and go, making this cycle of the nuclear story more durable than we've ever seen. It has moved, in our view, from rhetoric to action. Nuclear is recognized as essential, firm, reliable, carbon-free baseload energy that is truly desired and desirable around the world. Growing electricity demand from electrification, industry, and digital infrastructure, combined with underinvestment in primary supply, thinning secondary supplies, and long lead items, mean demand is looking to be underestimated and future supply to be overestimated. There is clearly global momentum, new interest from energy-intensive industries and tech, demand across near, medium, and long-term via restarts, deferred retirements, extensions, new builds, and geopolitics. Governments, countries, companies are still committing to net zero, and that continues to be a part of the story. The last piece I wanted to touch on was that the AI and data center demand is additive, but not the foundation of the momentum that we've seen, which clearly predates the AI boom.
Thanks a lot, Liam. That's a great sort of foundation for the conversation here. Anyone want to jump in on that particular the comments there? Leslie, go ahead. Michelle?
Yeah, Liam, I thought great points to get us started. One of the things that I keep coming back to as well for, really the case for nuclear, and it extends beyond Ontario and really beyond Canada's borders. But if we recall the Pathways to Decarbonization report that the ISO released a few years back, right? It called for about an increase of approximately 18,000 megawatts, so doubling that nuclear capacity. And we're even seeing stateside as a lot of states look at integrated system planning, building out of the grids, and retiring more high-emitting assets, really that need for that base load, that reliable, affordable, and secure power. So great way to kick us off, Liam. I thought it was fantastic.
Thanks. AJ, I'm going to go to you. And we've heard some of this from Liam already, but what are the most important, what do you think is the most important change in the recent past that's altered nuclear's outlook from your perspective? Is it policy? Is it power demand, as Liam's brought forward, or economics, or geopolitics, or why do you think we're in a new world?
Well, I should start by saying that I'm in general agreement with Liam and Michelle from a big picture perspective. I would say that one of the most important changes might be fading memories. And so, as Plant Vogtle has, shown a reliable operations, as Fukushima, recedes into the background, we're able to change the narrative a bit on nuclear, but we should be aware how quickly that narrative can turn. And that's why it's so important that we take a careful and thoughtful approach currently. Generally, I agree with Liam that the increase in load is one of the key drivers for the optimism about the nuclear sector. We're a bit more conservative than others when looking at long-term load growth. I think we're skeptical of the 75% by 2050 here in Ontario, for example. But generally, I think folks are recognizing that nuclear makes a great contribution to supply diversity and reliability. And I think one of the most remarkable things we're seeing is the new faces as counterparties. And so the fact that companies like Meta, Google, Microsoft, Amazon are signing up to long-term contracts with real financial commitments is triggering life extensions, restarts, even investments in new technologies like fusion. And that's something that we would not have anticipated, let's say, 10 years ago. And I think getting to the durability of this change, when we think about Diablo Canyon in California, which was one of the poster childs for anti-nuclear activists, actually getting a life extension, which is really a return to its actual operating life, I think that does say something about the durability of the change. What troubles me a little bit is that we haven't seen here in Canada as much involvement with these new counterparties. And that means that we may not be sharing the risk in the ways that we're seeing south of the border. But new faces and sustained load growth, I think, are the most important change that has contributed to the positive outlook for nuclear.
That's great. Thank you. And I think that's important perspective. I'm going to go to Pat next here, because Pat, I think this sort of leads into what AJ's just said is something that maybe you can address directly. As the representative on this panel discussion, who is actually operating a nuclear power plant, I think you probably and one who I think it's fair to say Bruce Power has ambitions to grow its existing facility with Bruce C. As sort of maybe perhaps you can get to that a little bit, but I'm thinking about some of the things that AJ said, and what in your experience, is it underappreciated? Some of what's going on in the nuclear renaissance, that that the life extensions and the uprates and some of the other things that Bruce Power's been doing, do those get enough recognition in this environment, or what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Ian. And let me just correct you. The last thing anybody wants is for me to operate a nuclear power plant. And fortunately, I don't do that at all. There are a number of qualified people and really, really smart, clever people who are doing that, as well as a number, thousands even, people who are working very hard day to day, keeping the lights on in Ontario, and working on the projects, the life extension work, the refurbs that we're doing at our site. And I wouldn't have said that it's this stuff's understated, but based on the answers that we've heard so far from the panelists, I would say maybe the successes of those refurbs are understated. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're experiencing sort of this interest in nuclear right now, as we're about 10 years into the refurbishment program in Ontario. when we talk refurbishment, like we're essentially dismantling the whole reactor and a number of the support systems, replacing steam generators, all the feeder pipes in these CANDUs. Like it's a massive undertaking. Between us and OPG, it's well north of a $25 billion investment in this crucial electricity infrastructure. And if you'd gone back when this plan was kind of laid out for Ontario, I'd say most would have assumed that this wouldn't go well. And fair, right? Like when we first undertook some of these refurb programs on some of the CANDU fleet, and the history of nuclear projects globally really has been, the story's always been, way longer than scheduled, way over budget, and the narrative was really nuclear can't come in on time and on budget. There was a real expectation laid out by the province that both Bruce Power and OPG collaborate closely to make sure that between our site, the 6 reactors at our site, and the 4 reactors at Darlington, that we actually deliver these projects on time, on budget. As I've said, they're massive projects. They really involved recapitalization of a huge supply chain in Ontario. Tens of thousands of jobs, manufacturing all around southwestern Ontario and beyond, that came together, planned, prepared, and now we're executing against that plan. And the great thing about nuclear, well, the challenge with nuclear is the first time we do something, it is a first of its kind, and it can be a challenge. And I think one of the mistakes that the industry, made dating back years and decades was that they always wanted to take what they'd done and improve on it. So almost every time you did something, it was a first of a kind project. What we've seen in the refurb program, that's 10 reactors that we've been doing, is we've gotten better from one reactor to the next. So we've decreased the timelines, decreased the cost, and the amazing thing is we're actually coming in on budget and ahead of schedule with this refurb program. If that hadn't been the case, if the first couple had not gone well, I don't think we'd be talking, nuclear as the future opportunity in Ontario. I think everybody would just say, yeah, it's the same old story with nuclear. And we know that as an industry. That's why in Ontario and Canada in particular, we've been very focused on these projects. Our owners, our workforce, this is what we are focused in on all the time, every day. They're about to be done, the Darlington refurb, and the whole thing's been a success. As they move through their first unit, which was Unit 2 back in 2015, we had already passed along all the information we had gathered from our initial refurbs of Unit 1 and 2 in the early 2000s. And as they moved through their Unit 2, they passed on what they learned as we started our Unit 6. And the information sharing and workforce coordination that we've had through these projects has allowed for success, and that's really what's created the opportunity for us going forward.
That's great context, Pat. I mean, I personally would agree that it sort of builds on the social license, for lack of a better term, that nuclear seems to have built up. Michelle, as we look to new nuclear deployment, and having heard what Pat has just outlined with regards to the refurbishment experience that Ontario has had, what do you think are some of the underappreciated constraints for new nuclear deployment? Whether it's siting or permitting or other considerations. What's on your mind when you're advising your clients?
I'd say, and this just comes from my background in the regulatory space. I genuinely think we need to get better at regulation across the entire value chain and think about this from mine to megawatt. So S&P did some research on about 127, I believe it was, mining projects. Canada overall came in about 2 years below the average. So our average mine time takes about 18 years. When you think of the ambition and what we're trying to accomplish, the regulatory process, including the volume of information that's required up front, the duplication in some respects from what is required at the federal level to the regional level to your municipal level for your infrastructure projects, and then the ability to pause the clock, I think really delays the opportunity. And one of the other things that I've seen a lot of is, and this isn't just alone to nuclear, but when governments reverse decisions or reverse policy around a particular investment, maybe because it's not aligned with a new incoming mandate, what it does is it doesn't just hurt that project, but it hurts investment overall. And I think we have to get savvier at not just, minimizing some of the project risks, like the UK did successfully with the RAB model and Sizewell C, but also from a government perspective, really seeing these things through as the long-term commitments that they are, so that it makes them more lucrative, if you will, to private investors, right? That and that we continue to capitalize on the opportunity, the momentum.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. Liam, I don't want to put you on the spot, but when in a prior conversation, we talked about regulatory reform being important for us to build momentum in the nuclear space. Do you want to provide some feedback on what Michelle had said there, or do you want to wait for later to get into that topic?
Sure, I can throw in some comments on that. As somebody who is a regular participant in proceedings, I can say that there is a predictable risk-based framework that, while not broken, I appreciate what was said earlier, that we do see lengthy timelines that could be improved. 18 years is a long time, and when we look at pre-approved or already licensed sites, there's a means, we talk about brownfield deployment of new nuclear, and an opportunity to optimize the existing regulatory framework. And what I mean by that, when those sites have been studied, they've been the homes of different facilities for many, many years, there's really an opportunity to ladder up the regulatory timeline by taking advantage of all of that technical work that has gone into supporting the licensing and continued operation of those facilities. We do think that without impacting safety or the environment, there's an opportunity to improve regulatory efficiency and effectiveness. With the federal government's red tape reduction initiative, there's a window that's open to review the existing framework, improve cost-benefit analysis of changes to new or existing regulatory requirements, and improve application review and decision-making timelines. We see the federal government establishing the Major Projects Office and other steps across Canada, and we are encouraged, but we also see sweeping changes in the US and the UK that leave us concerned that we're not modernizing our regulatory framework at a fast enough speed to keep up with those other charges. The only other thing I would add on regulatory causes us concern for sure. Another piece that we talk about a lot in this space, it relates to availability of labor, and particularly in the skilled trade. But when we moved from our Cigar Lake facility into the extension, we kept our people around, keep them working, because it's important to keep that skilled work. We're seeing other facilities that are proposed, and not just in the nuclear space, lots of push on around other, whether it's rare earth, whether it's copper, lots of interest in development, and a fight for similar skills and resources in that regard. So I think when we look at the framework on how we're going to satisfy that, I really think that the government has to be focused on this. When we look at an example that we've discussed with our British colleagues at Hinkley Point, they work with the labor unions there to have electricians, plumbers, and pipe fitters work across trades. So there's less waiting for a switch out between different tradespeople. And the example was the electricians focus on the terminations, but pipe fitters who were already in the area working on that particular piece can lay cable trays, was one of the examples. So that's, I do think that there is a good deal of energy required for focusing around labor and its availability as we go into construction and modification and all of those things.
That's great insight. I appreciate that. I'm mindful. Look, we could probably dive in. We probably spent a whole bunch of time on this initial theme. Probably spend another 20 minutes on it. But I'm mindful that we've got a few themes we're trying to cover off. So I think that there's one other point though. I want to give AJ an opportunity to kind of to weigh in here, because you've got some experience on the in looking at this, not just at nuclear, but broadly from a decarbonization perspective. Like, how do you see the balance shifting between decarbonization goals and energy security goals in the nuclear procurement world? Like, who's driving the shift? Is it government? Is it investors? Or is it everybody? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Ian. So I think for me, the story is less about energy security than it is about round-the-clock reliability. And I think that, historically we had a challenge with, what do we do with the off-peak portion of nuclear output? And the dynamics of load have changed dramatically. We have now the problem with the late evening ramp as solar goes offline, plus with initiatives for electrification of heating, the potential for the peak to actually occur later in the evening. And so I think that it's become increasingly recognized that nuclear is a zero-emitting resource that behaves much differently even than, let's say, solar plus battery or wind plus battery. And I think some of that is driven by large customers. I think investors are always going to be followers. Investors are going to be looking for secure long-term contracts. They're going to be looking for a predictable rate regulatory regime. And so we have the role of large customers in going out and trying to secure longer-term contracts, particularly folks that are concerned about the back end of the natural gas curve. Nuclear starts to look a bit more competitive under those circumstances. I think government's role in recognizing that as an employment creator, among the zero-emitting resources, nuclear has perhaps the best track record. And so that's made government an important player in trying to initiate and make more durable these investments in nuclear. But if we are not focused on reliability and affordability, I think that our message is going to get lost.
I think that's sage advice. Anyone else want to weigh in on that before we move on to theme 2?
Ian, I would just say you kind of asked about energy independence. Yeah. I don't think in today's context that's even an option, right? Like, we need to be able to provide the electrons at the end of the day. Like, when people don't care, generally speaking, about where their electricity comes from on any given time of the day, right? As long as they flip the switch, the light comes on, they're happy.
I bet they don't even know where it comes from.
They don't even know where. That's right. That's right. And for any jurisdiction to think that they're gonna rely on their neighbors for the power, that's not acceptable from anybody's perspective, right? And neighboring jurisdictions are going to prioritize their own grid. Things change. You look back a few years ago, and Quebec was doing everything it could to strike a sales deal to Ontario, to New York, to wherever else. And now here we are. They're basically capacity deficient, right? Just a few years later, we're brought on by a lot of electrification, some changes in plans, and whether we're gonna have a 75% increase in demand by 2050 or not, we know that demand is increasing, right? Like back in 2008, it was on an upward trajectory. Things did change. They slowed down. There was a financial crisis paired with a lot of efficiency gains in the grid, and we saw demand drop off quite a bit, which is how we ended up reaching that point that AJ was mentioning before around off-peak oversupply, surplus baseload generation. But those days are gone, right? We used to derate our units at night to provide less energy to the grid. We don't do that anymore. We're running full capacity 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. Basically to the end of the life of our facility. And demand isn't stopping. It's going to keep growing, whether it's 75%, 50%, 150%. Demand's going up, and we do need to plan to meet that demand by getting shovels in the ground and building things. And part of that's going to be baseload supply. And the best way to do that from a holistic economic perspective in Ontario, it's been shown time and time again, is certainly by investing in nuclear. And as well as others, right? One of Ontario's best assets is its electricity grid, which is diverse. It's made up of a little bit of everything. And I think this government is going that same way, looking at building a little bit of everything. Nuclear is obviously the cornerstone of that. And we're happy to provide that function. But that diversity in supply really is an asset. We've seen the impact in other jurisdictions in North America where they don't have diverse supply, and they get hit from a reliability perspective. So when you talk energy independence, I don't even think it's an option. I think people depend on it.
Yep. I would agree. And we need to collaborate within Canada and sort of also share the lessons that we've learned here with other jurisdictions too. Okay, so we've got a bit of an ambitious goal here with regards to the additional themes. So I think we've had a really good discussion on demand drivers. The next few themes is really about looking at it from the supply chain perspective, from the mines to the processing of uranium through to the conversion enrichment, and then looking at some of the global considerations. So this next theme, I want us to focus on uranium mining and processing, and looking at resilience beyond just more mines. And this gets us, I think, beyond Canada's borders to a material degree. So Michelle, I'm going to address this question to you first, but then invite others to weigh in too. So geopolitical tensions are an increasingly important consideration at play in the nuclear power sector. We note a substantial portion of the current global uranium mining capacities in Kazakhstan. We also note that a significant portion of the uranium conversion capacity is in China. In addition, a significant portion of the global uranium enrichment capacity is controlled by Russia. What are some of the near-term and longer-term implications that nuclear power plant operators in Western nations need to address to reduce dependency on these parts of the world? And where are these, and where might the disruptions be? And I'm going to invite Liam to respond to Michelle, because I think that Cameco is in a unique position to respond to some of these points too. Michelle, over to you.
I know you said beyond mines, but the CNSC just granted the license to prepare the site to Wheeler River. And Rook 1 just concluded their meetings with the CNSC in Saskatoon, I believe, on February 12th. So we're expecting a decision on that in the near-term future, and those would be significant uranium mines. So apologies, I started with the mines. But, one of the
that's good. That's good. We want to start with the mines. We got to get it out of the ground first, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I do sit on the science committee for MAC, and I love them. So I definitely think, those two projects, for example, and I know we're still waiting on Rook 1, but, that's a great signal, and it helps to Pat's point about reliability. When I think of reliability, affordability, and security, I almost see them as like interconnected. And so I think it boosts our supply reliability here in Canada. There's also the Sapporo 5. I believe that, Liam, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think that came out in 2022, and that was focused on, if you will, resiliency within the uranium supply chain. Japan, Canada, the UK, Australia, and I believe the United States is a part of that. They exceeded their goals in terms of the public-private fundraising. But we need to continue to support, whether it's through grants, incentives, policy, government signals. And I know there is one mine on the major projects list, but we need to continue to support these kinds of strategic partnerships over the long term, right? I think I go back to the fact that to me, this is an infrastructure play. And we need to think about this in terms of this is not a sprint, this is a marathon that we are investing in. If we are going to Pat's point, whether it's 75%, 150%, whatever it is, we know that we need more electricity, right? So we have to start planning and building all of the pieces that we need to ensure that we can have the system set up for the future, and then we can accommodate those needs. And that goes all the way back to the raw materials. So, I believe we need, long-term contracts is something we see, diversification in the supply chain, right? Like I think we've seen that as well, Canada in general. In a lot of cases, we've put all our eggs in one basket. We need to continue to diversify with our trading partners. Strategic stockpiles. So there has been a pull down in some of the places, especially in the US, where they've had those strategic stockpiles. And then really looking at, I do believe, getting really savvy on risk profiles throughout the project management process to really drive in private capital into some of these investments.
So on that, Michelle, I'd probably take a different tack. We really hesitate. We don't see the need for strategic supply. That sort of overhang has led to the market distortion that we've worked pretty hard to clear, as a lot of others. So what we end up is this very lumpy stall, go forward, stop, again, stall. Incentivizing uneconomic supply does not create healthy market conditions. So I do agree long-term pricing must be long-term contracts, long-term pricing. That's important. It has to be grounded in market fundamentals. So for us, the best way to support healthy supply is to support demand. Early government-backed orders enable private capital to follow on subsequent units and create a confident fuel buyer supporting long-term supply decisions. In relation to the another overlay that I think is important is origin risk and safeguards drives the need for Western aligned diversified supply portfolios. So again, return to the theme of long-term contracting. It is important to secure dependable supply that you have those long-term contracts in place. We know that the Kazakhs, for example, are now contracting more in the long-term market, taking a value over volume strategy, which does help to maintain a predictable market. When you look at the domestic supply chain, the development of that reduces long-term reliance on geopolitically exposed regions. So that's an important piece. In the question, Ian, I think you talked about China and their supply. China can't supply commercial conversion. It's actually integrated from upstream through to the fuel. So they can't just convert. It's the Russians who have about 30% of the conversion capacity worldwide. And that's where the pressure has been to try and replace that since the invasion of the Ukraine. When you look at the conversion capacity throughout the four Western facilities in the US, Canada, France, and the UK, the SFL, for example, which is owned by Westinghouse, which is in turn owned 49% by us, that facility is idle today in care and maintenance, but it needs long-term contracts to come back on. So, when you have 10 to 15 year tenure, you can make those long-term capital decisions and start to pull some of those back. So we have seen a rise in UF6 conversion prices, and there's still capacity that can be added through that long-term contracting strategy.
Interesting. And so to just dig into that a little bit further, as we sort of look at obviously we've talked about demand in Western nations and in Canada in particular, but in the U.S. We touched upon a little bit. But Liam, as you see other countries that have not had nuclear historically, is this part of the discussion with them when it comes to supply of uranium fuel, or is that sort of secondary to the like I'm thinking of countries in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world that have not had nuclear historically, but are certainly looking at opportunities. Are they thinking about supply contracts at this stage, or is it more about other things that are more important at this stage? Oh, you're on mute.
They're much more focused on reactor selection, technology selection, going through their down select process and working through that. It is, one of the things that we do point out, and was touched on earlier by Michelle. You can bring on conversion, you can bring on enrichment. You're building a plant, so that's a capital question, and known technologies there in for the most part. But you can't necessarily create a mine out of thin air. So the mining piece is can be a natural constraint in that regard. But we do think that one of the pieces that looms is the reasonableness we're seeing, the transparency on cost and timelines. We do feel that the market is underestimating what it takes to bring on a mine in northern Saskatchewan. We know we're on the east side of the Athabasca Basin, but the west side, is underdeveloped in comparison. Power lines do not exist. Few roads, bridge replacement, need to build those mines. So, when we look at what the costs are to build in these areas and bring on a mine, it's much more expensive than what we're seeing in some of the feasibility studies. And you got to remember, we own and operate 4 facilities in northern Saskatchewan, so we're not guessing at this. So, when the other piece that we look at in the context of the conversation around timing and bringing projects on has really been on the permitting that we touched on earlier, as well as Indigenous partnerships and establishing those and getting those to a point where there's support for new facilities in particular.
That's great. That's great, and it's great to get some context in that. Anyone else want to provide some feedback or thoughts on that? All right, I'm going to go to the next question. I'm going to direct this one to Pat. So, as an operator, how do existing power plant operators ensure safe and reliable nuclear fuel? And if you've seen some insights from Michelle and Liam here, but what are your perspectives on some of the matters we've raised in the context of getting access to fuel as we look to expand significantly nuclear power over the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, that expansion, we'll see how that expansion plays out, right? What technologies are used. But, and I just thought of something. I should have thought of this before, but I want to use a prop here to kind of say what we do now. So this is a fuel bundle, right? And what we do in CANDU reactors is we take essentially the uranium that Liam and the team mine in Saskatchewan that they ship here, process it, get into these fuel bundles. These fuel bundles get loaded into the CANDU reactors and are surrounded by heavy water, and that's what allows us to produce the fission reaction. It's unenriched uranium. It really is like we have a campaign called Canadian at our core. Clever pun, isn't it? And really, this is a made in Canada story, right? Where we don't rely on any other countries to do this. We work very closely with our friends at Cameco. In fact, we have long-term contractual arrangements with them that have been made public over the years, where this really is Saskatchewan to our reactors process. Neat technology, neat way to approach it. Going forward, I think decisions are going to get made, and I know Cameco have have looked at opportunities at enrichment. Should that be the way that that reactors go? And we'll be looking to work very closely with them going forward as we look at expanding in Ontario. So, to me, it's a great, when we talk energy independence, nuclear is such a great example of how that can be done, of how Canadians have sort of led in this area, how we can do it all within the boundaries of this country, and we don't actually need to rely on external parties to do it. In fact, it represents an export opportunity for us for now and the years ahead. So that's sort of my short answer to your question. But to me, it's just such a beautiful story when you look at how we can do this from mine to reactor to electricity, turning on your lights, all right here in Canada without having to rely on other places, other countries, and their technologies.
Awesome. And you get extra marks for bringing a prop. Anybody else wants to? anyone else want to bring a prop forward? Okay, I don't have one, folks. So good for you, Pat. Thanks. That's great. I think in the interest of time, we should move on to the next theme because and Pat, you've kind of introduced it a little bit. We talked, and so the next theme is really about conversion and enrichment. And Liam, I'm going to come back to you on this one. So again, Pat's raised the point that Canada's blessed with with a lot of this stuff here, but Canada's blessed with substantial uranium deposits. Cameco provides significant domestic conversion capacity, and to date, Canada operates. The Canadian operators have not been doing enrichment services because we don't need to, because Canada reactors use natural uranium. But that's changing. With the Darlington SMRs, which rely upon an enriched uranium. What from your perspective, and as Cameco is a significant player in Westinghouse, what are the Canadian operators doing to address the need for enrichment services? And what's Cameco's views on some of this?
Sure, thanks. Just capitalizing on what Pat said in his last response about the CANDU technology, that we mine the uranium, we process it at Blind River. We are the only producers of uranium dioxide. That's the fuel that goes into the CANDU reactors. We also have our chemical fuel manufacturing. We make the bundles that Pat was hoisting in front of us there. And in that space, we've had a great working relationship with the operators in Canada, the CANDU fleet, and servicing it, and so continue to enjoy the benefits of that integrated supply chain that Pat touched on. That being said, the CANDU reactors are older Gen 2, and we are part owners, as I indicated earlier, of Westinghouse, and Westinghouse has the AP 1000 Gen 3 Plus. It's deployment ready, modern passive safety design, fully digital controls, multiple jurisdictional licenses. I had the good fortune to tour the Vogtle site in October with my board and see the facilities there. And so there is a path there. We think that it's a very attractive technology. In addition, it's been built in China, so it's operating, it's stress tested. In respect of enrichment, Cameco spent a fair bit of time and money in relation to global laser enrichment and achieved a technology readiness level 6 last year. And there's a long-term path for that facility that's based in the U.S. to re-enrich United States Department of Energy tails, which essentially gives Canada, Western markets, a prospective non-Russian enrichment lever as a program scale. We also know the U.S. is actively rebuilding domestic enrichment capacity. The DOE announced a multi-year $2.7 billion HALEU enrichment procurement program to catalyze a Western supply chain. So there's clear policy levers that enrichment is moving west, and queue positions will favor proven light water reactor fleets like AP 1000.
That's That's a lot of info. And look, and promising. I mean, I know there's a we've got an interesting opportunity in Canada. I want to get through. I want to have a deeper conversation about what a next generation can do versus Westinghouse, or maybe both in Canada. Maybe we can get into some of that down the road. I do want to get some additional viewpoints on again, and it sounds like you guys have addressed the need for how we address the need for additional enrichment facilities. At least that there seems to be a strong pathway there, which is great. But I want to go to AJ next. We've had a lot of hype over SMRs, and there's been some high profile public offerings in the U.S., and we've seen some interesting developments, particularly in the U.S., but in some other places as well. And we've obviously got the Darlington SMR going on, being built by GE Hitachi and OPG in Ontario. From your perspective, as the economist at the table here, and sort of thinking about costing and so on, how should SMRs and other nuclear developers and utilities allocate risk contractually? Like, there's fuel risk, fuel pricing risks, there's allocation risk, there's qualification risks, there's the other risks I'm sure you can probably delve us into, but at the present time there is not a lot of production of fuel that would go into some of these facilities, especially the newer ones. What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Ian. I think it's interesting. You laid out a list of risks, and I think the challenge is always, how do we think about this relative to existing established pathways? And so, fuel price risk, I'm of the view that we kind of know how to allocate that, and that historically that's been on the final customer. And it hasn't mattered whether we're talking about uranium or whether we're talking about natural gas. For the most part, in vertically integrated, traditionally regulated regimes, we have what are effectively fuel cost pass-through. As long as the utility doesn't do something completely crazy that would lead to an imprudence finding, fuel price risk is a pass-through to the final consumer. I think availability risk is a bit more challenging because it depends on things like, is it force majeure or not? And we also have to think about, the final consumer, the electricity consumer, cares most about, plant level availability. But if that availability in turn is impacted by the fuel supply being unavailable due to a transportation shortfall, a shutdown at the mine, we've seen this interesting situation at Ford, where their primary aluminum supplier had a series of fires at their plant, and so they weren't able to supply aluminum. In that case, ultimately Ford had to take the hit. So I think that the availability risk is going to be something that ultimately you manage through a degree of redundancy in the system, and you need to pay for that. And what's challenging in these kinds of fuel price pass-through regimes is whether you're going to get second-guessed for maintaining that degree of slack in the system to assure that availability is maintained. So I think fuel price risk is clearly on the consumers. I think availability is somewhat a shared responsibility based on the degree of redundancy that is needed in the system. the question of qualification and schedule risk, which are ultimately going to drive, cost overruns, I think that you're going to eventually need some kind of a government backstop, especially if some of these things are within the control of the government themselves. And we need to think about things like, first risk, second risk, and so forth. So we have tranches so that we avoid having some free rider problems. But, I think generally when we look at schedule and quantification risk, it's really a question of, well, did you do a poor job of, either managing your qualification process or of scheduling your project, in which case it should ultimately go back to the suppliers, or was that something that was completely within the government's control? They didn't staff the regulator appropriately. And I think if that's the case, then we need to have mechanisms that the government steps in and takes responsibility for some of those particular risks that are within the control of the government.
Could I just add a quick point to any folks who aren't overly familiar on nuclear? Nuclear is very different than, let's say, a natural gas facility, right? Like for CANDU, we can store months worth of fuel at our site, being ready to use it, kind of thing. Other reactors only refuel every couple of years. So, and fuel, for that matter, is a small portion of the actual overall cost of nuclear power. So per megawatt hour, it makes up only a fraction of the overall price. So it's a very different driver from an economic perspective and a scarcity perspective in terms of the price overall impact to nuclear than you would get, let's say, from a natural gas facility, for example. So I just wanted to add some of that context in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a important consideration. I'm not sure if anybody is comfortable responding to this point, but in the overall, the amount of energy that can be generated from, the fuel that would be in Pat's fuel bundle behind him, would be dramatically greater than, a significant amount of, natural gas. And so, I guess
it's the soda can, Pat. Remember, if all the power you ever used in your lifetime came from nuclear, your waste would fit inside a soda can.
Yep.
A lot of power in those atoms.
Exactly. That fuel bundle would easily power you for all the electricity you need for your entire life.
Can I just say something when we're talking about risk? And, Pat had heard me in September when we were in the UK, and, the announcement was made to the funding of Sizewell C by La Caisse in Quebec, right? We have some of the largest pension funds by value size, right, globally. And that regulated asset-based model really drew in fact, it was oversubscribed, the investment into Sizewell C. And I think when we talk about risk, that to me is a really smart example of, okay, for the private investors, if the project maintains at or below the low threshold, here's what you'll get in terms of a return. If you start to creep above that, but you stay below the high threshold, here's what your return profile looks like. And then if, everything goes to heck in a handcart, the government will step in and ensure that the project is still completed. And I think that to me, when we saw all of the private capital flow in, tells me that they have solved a lot of that equation as to offsetting the risk, at least from a financial perspective, to get people to make those investments.
Michelle, I guess one of the questions that I have that concerns me both as an Ontario ratepayer and as an Ontario taxpayer is, do you think that Ontario has this risk allocation right? Because ultimately, with the government as the 100% shareholder of OPG, we all bear the risk on both sides, right? If the costs go up, they're either going to show up in an increase in the power price that's passed through, because the Ontario Energy Board is not going to have the ability to say no, or we as taxpayers will increase the provincial rebate so that electricity prices stay low, but we have less flexibility from a tax perspective. And when I think about Plant Vogtle, I'm sure it was not a happy experience for the folks at Georgia Power, but ultimately the ability for the regulator to say, look, there's a piece of this that comes out of the shareholders. A piece of this came through the Westinghouse restructuring, and then a piece of it came from ratepayers. We're really not doing that here in Ontario. So I guess, what do you think about the risk allocation here in Ontario relative to what you've observed with Sizewell C?
I mean, and I know Pat brought it up initially, but what we have seen with the major with the refurbishments, with the major projects out of Ontario, to me, is a good signal for the industry and for investors, right? Like, they have been able to deliver major capital projects. And it's interesting because even globally, people will reference Ontario as an example, right? So globally, you'll hear the nuclear industry reference the accomplishments and the achievements in Ontario, at least from that perspective. I think that I still think that we need to continue to figure out how to better draw in some of that private capital, right? I was engaged in conversations in the fall, and I think that a regulated asset-based type of model could work in Ontario. The parameters would have to be adjusted if you're looking at a jurisdiction like Alberta, for example. But I think the track record of the supply chain from Cameco through Bruce Power, look at what Ontario Power Generation is doing. I think that, not only are we a tier 1 nuclear nation, but I think Ontario's success is really a model for the world, right? Even with the SMR, right? First project in the G7, right?
Yeah. Also, I think you forgot that I'm on this panel. So we are a privately owned.
Thank you for being patient.
I can never forget about you. I just don't want to put words in your mouth.
So
just Battenberg cake.
Yeah.
When we look at the refurb program, as I mentioned before, there's 6 reactors being done at Darlington, or they're almost completed. But then, 4 at Darlington, and then 6 at Bruce Power, where again, there's a huge risk transfer away from the tax base, rate base, and put onto the private sector. Once we lock in our projects with the province, and we lock in a cost estimate, anything outside of the parameters of that contract, it's we eat it, so to speak. So when you look at that overall project, 60% of it was transferred over to the private sector in terms of managing that risk. And I think that balance of having Crown Corps along with private sector is similar to what we've seen in other jurisdictions where it's worked, or in the UK with Sizewell C. So I think the province is looking at ways to diversify that risk away and bring private money in, transferring risk away from just the ratepayer and taxpayer.
Well, I love the Bruce Power model. I started my career here in Canada with British Energy, in looking at that leasing model. What concerns me is when push comes to shove, I think there is a risk that projects are going to be put not into the Bruce Power model, but into the OPG model. And that's not to take away from all of the accomplishments that both Bruce and OPG have made over the past 25 years. I think it's fantastic. What I worry about is the first of a kind risk with SMRs and AP1000s in Canada, and how that risk is being shared.
I think so. We kind of we dove in head first with theme number 4, which is global considerations. And I think it's great. And I think, Liam, you've been patiently waiting, but Brookfield in the US, Department of Energy have put forward an interesting model with regards to addressing some of these significant risks. Do you want to provide some thoughts on that, and how that kind of model may play a role in sharing risk in respect of future projects?
Sure. I guess there's two threads there. One is a U.S. government deal that was signed with ourselves in Brookfield in the fall, allocating $80 billion to go after AP 1000 construction, a build-out program there. There's also the now energy dominance program that's looking at providing answers to some of those questions. I think that that were being framed earlier in the discussion around risk and cost sharing. Grant Isaac talks about, in this environment, how there's a race for the bronze prize, that there's really not a lot of incentive to get after the gold and silver because you have that first of a kind cost, and then getting it down to the nth of a kind, the way Pat described their MCR work at Bruce. That's where everyone wants to be, and that's part of the reason we think the AP 1000 is so attractive in the U.S., because we are at into that sixth and seventh of kind of supply chain's been worked out. I think that when you look across the U.S., there are just it's pick a state, pick a location, it's different because you have so many different players as it relates to the different pieces. Legacy, they got labs, they've got different levers that they're pulling out there. I think the perspective is that those projects have the funding that provides that security, that backstop in relation to them, and just getting the utilities involved is going to be really important. And I think that we talk a lot about some of the restarts, and one is the Microsoft and the funding in relation to what was 3 Mile Island, and now the Clean Energy Center. Their Constellation side, a 20-year PPA underpinning the investments to refurbish that facility and bring it back online. So, there's three models right there, right? When you walk through it, there is a lot of interest. I really appreciate the perspective of Michelle as it relates to the UK facility that was oversubscribed on the private side, making it attractive. So there's a community of the willing here, and very interested. And I think that it's difficult to say all the permutations that's going to take, but there's no question that we've moved beyond in the AP 1000 conversation, the design risk, technology risk. What we're talking about is financing, and that's a good thing, because that means we're that much closer to those facilities being greenlit and undertaken.
That's great insight. I appreciate that. Anyone want to jump in on that with regards to, that there are, there's obviously private sector interest. There's obviously a desire for more private sector engagement in the nuclear space, and obviously, Pat, you're a good example of that with your principal backers at OMERS and TC Energy. And so you've got a long history of this, but what's your perspective on how these international developments are proceeding, and what some of the models are, and how comfortable you are sort of talking about what your thoughts are going forward. But I'm sure you have some thoughts on how private sector can play a role here.
We definitely have thoughts. We are looking at just to start off, we think our model's a great one, right? Like the current one we have right now, working through the life extension program. It's been successful. It seems to, there's incentives in it to reduce costs, and even when we do reduce costs, there's risk sharing or cost savings sharing mechanisms where essentially when we're able to save money, we give half of that back to the province. And again, as I said before, if we don't perform according to the parameters of our contract, we have to take that risk. It incentivizes all the right behaviors. It helps protect ratepayers while attracting private capital, which at the end of the day helps out Ontarians for that matter, right? You mentioned our owners. OMERS is one of them, right? So as we look at municipal employees and the pensions that they're counting on, they can know with a lot of confidence that a chunk of their investment anyway is being put into an asset like ours that has close scrutiny from government, that we're very accountable for, that's transparent, and frankly well framed to help protect the ratepayer as well as keep the taxpayer safe. So with that sort of those key principles in mind, with a defined role for government, a defined role for the system operator, and a defined role for the private sector, finding ways to reduce the cost of capital, attract that capital. So in other words, de-risking these projects while still, keeping competitive tension in play to keep costs down. I think that's sort of the secret sauce that'll enable a cost-effective deployment of new nuclear. So, there's different opportunities. We're looking at Bruce C. We're looking at building on, the great experience we've had in the refurb program and building something new. OPG, of course, are looking at their own projects. But as we look at Bruce C. and we run our competitive process for technology selection, everything that's going on globally, all the pros and cons, lessons learned, and operational experience, or OPEX as we call it, is being kind of incorporated into that. And ideally, at the end of the day, what we have is a model that'll continue on what we've done so successfully over the last number of years as we look at new build.
I think that's great. I appreciate that. And I guess we're kind of delving into our last theme, our fifth theme, which is, what other Canadian specific considerations are at play here. And Pat's kind of, you've perhaps stolen the thunder, maybe some other speakers here, but maybe I'll let Michelle kind of jump in. What's your perspective on, the world? We've got potential opportunities in Alberta. There's talks, that New Brunswick's continuing to think about opportunities. And obviously there's lots of talk about Canada and Canadian technology playing a role internationally. From your standpoint at Deloitte, what's your thoughts here?
Well, I mean, look, I think Canada has tremendous potential internationally, and Liam referenced the $80 billion investment in the AP1000s south of the border. So, across the United States, we're seeing significant investment in the form of tax credits, incentives to really drive nuclear. In some states, those investment tax credits can be worth up to about 50% of the project value if you can also demonstrate prevailing wages and apprenticeships. We're seeing, the mine to megawatt strategy in France. The UK, of course, you've got Sizewell C, but you've also got tremendous interest in fusion. So, I like to call it nuclear's little brother, but, there's a tremendous opportunity for Canada as well with respect to the fuel supply chain, right? As we look at the fusion side of the equation, Sweden's looking at nuclear, and then you've got new to nuclear communities as well that are also looking. And I think that Canada has tremendous potential in our technology, in our, in our mining. I look at Cameco with what you have accomplished, Liam and team, with respect to working with communities in northern Saskatchewan. Like, that is such a huge success story to me as to, what Cameco has been able to accomplish working with those communities. And I also think it's our people, right? It's the skilled trades, it's the engineers, it's our knowledge of the industry. And the one thing that I'll say, having been adjacent to this industry for quite a few years now, is the people, right? Like, I know it employs almost 100,000 people, but I tell people, I'm like, the nuclear industry just feels like one big extended family. And you've got a lot of passionate, committed people in this industry. And I'm so glad that nuclear has this momentum now, because 10 years ago, we were in a much different position. And I think Ontario and Canada have what it takes to lead.
I like that. I like that. But frankly, it's not going to be easy, right? I mean, we don't have $80 billion to throw around. Not that I'm suggesting it's being thrown, but like, we don't have the financial capacity that the United States has or some other jurisdictions have. And so I think, we can't rest on our laurels by any stretch.
I don't think we can rest, but I also think, and we've seen this in Ontario, like, making a commitment to nuclear, making it a strategic priority, and then, pulling on all pieces of the value chain and making those investments and sequencing out the projects. It to me, as Michelle and not my employer, I do believe that nuclear is and should be a strategic imperative for Canada for so many of the reasons that these panelists have outlined today and many more. Right? There's huge social value in this industry, environmental benefits, economic, you name it, right?
Agreed.
Yeah,
Agreed.
I'd follow on that, Michelle, in relation to, appreciate the support and the kind words. We are extremely proud to be Canadian. We're headquartered in Saskatoon. We are the largest industrial employer of Indigenous people in Canada, something that doesn't necessarily get a lot of profile. And that's hard-won through many, many years of engagement and working with our neighbors in the north, and more recently in Ontario, as it relates to our facilities. I think that in my view on this, I like the framing that there's a lot of opportunity in front of us. I do think that the planning across the fuel cycle is important, and the recognizing that these are long-lived assets, right? So in that space, you really want to be looking at technology that's proven, but not dated if you're looking at a 60, 80-year operating life for those facilities. So again, when we talk about AP1000, I've been saying we own 49% of Westinghouse. The other 51% is another Canadian company, Brookfield Renewable. So 100% Canadian owned Westinghouse AP1000. And, when we look at the advantages of being able to move first on that, the opportunity, you get to be in the front of the supply chain. And there's an opportunity as it relates to Canadian localization. We've done some numbers where about 80% of the building can be from Canadian suppliers. So in that space, you then set yourself up on an industrial policy level for an export market that the world is interested in. As you can see, the announcements from the various jurisdictions in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So pulling yourself into that space is really important. And we have been a participant in this industry through some good times and some bad as well. Our Tim Gitzel talks about 10 years of really hard road that we had to walk. But we are unique in our global reach as it relates to Canadian companies. We bring a lot of domestic expertise, that supply chain, and aligned national interests with Canadian deployment. So I think that we do see a road forward both in Canada, but doing it smartly sets us up for our ability to execute and support other projects internationally and really export that expertise, that family that Michelle had referenced.
Thanks, Liam. That's great, and I had not appreciated the degree to which you had engaged with Indigenous communities so significantly. So maybe I should trumpet that a little more effectively, and we'll do this. We'll do the same. So I'm mindful of time, folks. We've had a great conversation here, and we've kind of we have to wrap it up in the next sort of 6 or 7 minutes or so. There's one question that's coming from the audience that I want to put to the group here, and I'll let anybody sort of speak to it, but I'll just read it out loud. Canadian research has shown that CANDU power output can be significantly increased by using slightly enriched uranium. Should we be considering this to help meet our growing energy demands with our existing nuclear fleet? I don't know whether Pat or Liam want to touch on that one or not. Any thoughts?
I can touch on it. Like, I think we'd have to talk to the folks at CANDU to properly answer that question. And again, I'll preface this answer by saying we're running a competitive process right now. I would say one of the things I mentioned before was the risk of first of its kind, right? And as we're looking at new nuclear being built, I do believe there was a time a number of years ago where they were looking at slightly enriched fuel for the CANDUs. In the context of first of a kind, I suspect that probably the next CANDU to be built probably won't use enriched fuel. I think in a way that takes away from one of the things in favor of a CANDU reactor is that it doesn't use or need enriched fuel. Down the road, is that an opportunity? Is there going to be more research and studies done and designs looked at? Couldn't tell you. It might add value, might not. But in my mind anyway, probably not likely to be in the near future.
Can I just say, when we talk about first of a kind too, because Pat, I know you've brought that up a few times, like when you look at Darlington, like they were recently granted a 20-year license. Like that is the first of its kind. Like that is Canadian history in the making. So, I suspect if you had another grid scale CANDU, it would be very close to the Darlington units we see today, just probably upgraded to meet, the latest codes and standards. And Liam, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that there are 6 AP1000s that are currently in operation globally between the United States and China. So, when we talk about eliminating that first of a kind risk, we also have a great track record as Canadians for that too.
Good point. Okay, I'm going to move to our closing question, because all these panels have to have some closing question, because we can't just sort of turn our videos off and go our separate ways. And you've all been very patient with my questions to date, so I'm going to hand the floor over to the 4 panelists here. But here's the question. Given what you've learned in your experience to date working in the nuclear energy sector, what 2 pieces of advice or insights would you like to share? You can direct your thoughts to any of the following: an entrepreneur, a senior executive at a bank or a senior public company, an investor, some government official, or an engaged student looking for an exciting career going forward. And I will let Pat, you speak first.
Okay. I think I could direct this at all of the above. If I had to pick sort of 2 things, one goes back to my university days, and I had a prof, and I studied finance in university. Boy, have I changed careers. But I studied finance in university, and I had a prof who was great. I actually took a number of his courses, and he had a number of sayings that he used to always come up with. And one of them was, there are no free lunches. And he used to say it all the time, like almost every class. He's like, remember, folks, in finance, there are no free lunches. I would say that is sort of the golden rule for this industry. Whether it's the cost of risk, time, changing things, nothing you do in this industry is free. And as we look at opportunities going forward, they're not free either. They're, as I said, contingent on us continuing to perform well on our existing projects. And all it takes is one sort of mistake for all this momentum to be lost. So we need to hold on to this opportunity, really seize it, because the cost of not doing that is massive. And the other piece kind of builds off that a little bit is really when you make decisions, and this is broader than just nuclear, but applies to nuclear. When you make decisions around how you're going to build out an electricity system, as with other infrastructure, it's not just, it can't just be a dollars per megawatt story, right? The levelized cost of energy can't be the sole criteria that you build a system on. Just a micro example, if you just built your system on wind on a non-windy day, you'd be in a lot of problems, right? So even if you've got a lower cost of that resource, that's not the whole story. Just like nuclear, it doesn't stop with the dollars per megawatt hour. It's a 100-year asset that employs thousands of people and stimulates the economy. And when you start looking at the bigger picture of things, I think that's the right way to build out a system. I know what they've done in the US has largely been based on capacity auctions and the next marginal cost of the next marginal megawatt, but that's not necessarily the way you want to plan an electricity system. So finding a way to manage risk and plan holistically is where those two pieces kind of come together. No free lunches, and look at the big picture when you plan things, and that'll get you to where you want to get.
Thanks, Pat. I see Michelle nodding, and I see AJ kind of smiling a little bit. And who feels like responding next on this last question?
Well, I mean, I also have this weird background where I did atmospheric physics and journalism and found myself in nuclear and completely fell in love with the industry. And to Pat's point, and to me, it all comes down to the people, right? Like my advice would be, if somebody's looking for an exciting career where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to be innovative, to be creative, and to really chart a course that has an impact for the province and beyond, that nuclear is a place that I would strongly consider all young people to look at, whether that's trades or engineering, right? Like there's a huge trades opportunity. And then I think that my other piece would be, in Canada, we tend to do a lot of talking. And we need to roll up our sleeves and actually start the building and the doing. And as much as thought leadership is fantastic, we need a lot more getting our hands dirty, putting shovels in the ground, and really working together to make things happen.
Good advice. AJ, I'm going to go to you next. I'm going to get Liam to close us out at the end.
Thanks, Ian. I'm smiling a little bit because, if you're coming out with a high LCOE, you're always going to argue that the LCOE isn't the appropriate metric. But that said, I do believe that, nuclear is an important part of the supply mix and should be around the world, and that it has value that isn't completely captured in the LCOE. I think that the two things that I would focus on are, first, I am concerned that we're not adapting and enforcing some kind of a fleet approach. And we've seen, Clean Prosperity and others talk about, picking one technology for the micro, one technology for the small, and one technology for the large. And, while I prefer a made in Canada approach, I'm actually indifferent as to which technologies are chosen to be the fleet leader in each of those categories, but we have to do it. If we end up with different SMR technologies in each province, there's no way that we're going to reach the economies of scale that are necessary to bring that nth of a kind cost down. So I think the first is that this, choosing a fleet leader matters, and we need to do it very, very soon. I think the second is, I'm concerned that, governments need to find the point in the supply chain where they can do what nobody else can. And I'm not convinced that government support for generation, as opposed to ratepayer support, is necessary. I think that there are other areas where government dollars have a higher multiplier, particularly at the federal level, and that where that focus should be, and whether that's on the workforce development side, or if we decide that enrichment and reprocessing is something that's beneficial to the Canadian economy, giving that a jump start. But I think we need to be mindful of getting the most bang for our buck out of whatever support comes from, particularly the federal Treasury. And I'm not convinced that we're thinking about that in a holistic way.
Interesting. Right. That's a whole other webinar we can have, and maybe some sort of royal commission or something. We can have a conversation about all that stuff. I'm intrigued. Liam, I'm going to give you the last word. You're the man who's the general counsel at the a company that's leading the charge in a lot of this stuff. What are your final concluding thoughts here?
I'd echo what Michelle had to say if I was talking to a student. I have two young boys, and I extol the virtues of our industry at every opportunity. I think it's a great place to work at Cameco. It's a great industry to be in, and I've really enjoyed my time in it. What I would say if I was giving senior government official advice, my line would be that execution matters more than announcements. Value in this conversation goes to those who deliver repeatable, proven nuclear projects. I think that's the key that unlocks so many of these doors, is that and Michelle touched on it too. Thought leadership only takes you so far. So we're at the point where we should be actioning, taking steps, trying to execute, to be brave around these pieces. Operators will tell you they're, despite the history of cost overruns, every single one of them is pleased as punch to have those assets now, particularly given the life extensions. So take your point, AJ, on economics on the front end, but the reality for the utilities has been that they've been very, very pleased with those assets that they've been able to operate for 60 and now into 80 years.
We are very pleased, and we are an anchor price in terms of the Ontario pricing system. We've got a price well below the average cost of electricity in this province. So not just the higher LCOEs have this perspective. I'm just saying there's a lot more value add to the broader economy than a price of power.
Excellent. Well, look, we could probably continue this discussion for another, hour, but we won't. I really appreciate you spending your afternoon with us and sharing all these insights. It's been illuminating for me, and I'm proudly been in this sector for more than a couple decades, and so it's fun to kind of delve into some of these issues and learn from each of you. So thank you for taking the time. Fasken has had a proud history of putting on these seminars over the course of the last 16 years, and we will continue to do so. I just want to remind those who are attending, please provide some feedback with regards to the survey, and then please also consider attending our other seminars. There's one tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can get access from the website. That one's on sanctions and tariffs and the financial and operational risks that every mining executive must understand. And obviously that's a pretty important consideration. But there's other ones all through next week during the actual PDAC conference. So if you're in Toronto, you're welcome to attend in person at any of those. If you're not in Toronto, you can attend online. They're all hybrid. But until the next time, thank you on behalf of Fasken for each of our panelists, Liam, AJ, Michelle, Pat. We appreciate you making the effort and providing the insights, and look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.